Hello, everybody. Welcome to Resounding Visions. I'm Christine Diekman, and I'm a professor in the Department of Art, Media, and Design, where I teach film and video production and theory. And I'm also the professor of sound studies. This is one of the courses that is hosting our series, Resounding Visions. And I'm here with my colleague, Professor Diaz.
Hello, everyone. My name is Misael Diaz. I'm an assistant professor of art, media, and design at Cal State San Marcos and the instructor of AMD 368, Art of World Cultures, which is the other course that is hosting the Resounding Vision speaker series this semester. As with previous presentations, we wanted to begin today with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that Professor Diekman and I are speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay peoples, that our presenter, Raven Chacon, will be speaking to us from the homelands of the Ohlone peoples, and that the meeting place of CSUSM and its surrounding areas is still home to the 6 federally recognized bands of the La Jolla, Paula, Pama, Pechanga, Rincon, Soboba Luiseño, Payam people. We would like to take this moment to acknowledge and express our appreciation and respect for those groups whose homelands we reside and learn on, recognizing that they have been stewards of this land from time immemorial and continue to live on this land in spite of the ongoing violence of settler colonialism. We honor their resilience and strength and express solidarity with efforts to undo the intentional erasure of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Misael, for that acknowledgement. Let's just take a few moments to honor this resilience and strength and feel our solidarity. So welcome again to Resounding Visions. This is a year-long series of BIPOC artists, musicians, and scholars who work at the intersection of sound and art to explore forms of cultural resistance and affirmation. The programming committee for this series includes faculty members Misael Diaz, Christine Diekman, that's me, Ana Luisa Patrisco, and Jeff Ray. I want to extend a very special thank you to Steve and Laura Wagner and to the Epstein Family Foundation for their generous funding that makes all these events possible. We also want to thank the School of Arts staff for their support, especially Albert Rescon and Kevin Coleman. All of the presentations are online via Zoom with a link provided before the presentation, as you know, and events are Thursdays at 5:30 Pacific Standard Time. So we urge you to stay informed by following us on Instagram, and I'll type it into the chat again. And so I pasted that into the chat. And now Professor Diaz will offer more information and introduce our presenter for tonight.
So before I introduce today's guest speaker, Raven Chacon, I wanted to let you all know that in lieu of using the chat to share questions and or comments with our presenter, we ask that you please use the Q&A function. The chat will be closed shortly. So again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share those by typing them into the Q&A, and we will make sure to address them during the portion of the presentation where we will be fielding questions from the audience. Today's presentation by Raven Chacon will last approximately 50 minutes, and afterwards we'll be opening up to addressing some of those questions and comments. We will be reading those aloud for our responder to respond to. So again, please make use of the Q&A function to engage with tonight's speaker. Now it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Raven Chacon. Raven Chacon is a composer and visual artist born in Fort Defiance, Navajo Nation, Arizona. His work explores notions of time, presence, absence, and the political dimensions of sound, especially as it pertains to the displacement and resistance of Indigenous communities. He has recorded and performed works for classical and electronic instruments with ensembles nationally and abroad, and was a member of the American Indian Arts Collective Postcommodity from 2009 to 2018. Chacon has an MFA from the California Institute of the Arts and has served on the Music and Native American Studies faculties at the University of New Mexico, as well as a visiting artist in the New Media Art and Performance program at Long Island University. As a solo artist or collaborator, Chacon has exhibited or performed at Whitney Biennial, Documenta 14, REDCAT, Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montréal, San Francisco Electronic Music Festival, Chaco Canyon, Ende Tymes Festival, 18th Biennial of Sydney, and the Kennedy Center. He is a recipient of the United States Artist Fellowship in Music, the Creative Capital Award in Visual Arts, the Native Arts and Culture Foundation Artist Fellowship, and the American Academy's Berlin Prize for Music Composition. As an educator, Chacon has served as composer in residence for the Native American Composer Apprentice Project, NACAP, since 2004, teaching string quartet composition to hundreds of American Indian high school students living on reservations in the Southwest U.S. Under his instruction, this project was awarded the National Arts and Humanities Youth Program Award from the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities in 2011. Current projects include composing the piece La Indita Cautiva for the most recent iteration of the Prototype Festival, Modulation, and co-composing the opera Sweetland, an opera about colonialism and a parable for our time about hosts and arrivals, which was recently chronicled by the New York Times. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome, Raven Chacon.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle and Christine, for having me and letting me talk about some of this new work I've been doing. And what I decided to do was piece together some past works and combine it with another PowerPoint I had on my computer called What Gets Amplified, and then talk about this new work that I completed with my partner and collaborator Candace Hopkins over COVID time this past year. And I'm still figuring out Zoom. I just learned a new thing about original sound, but let me fire this up. Okay, well, this page here is from one of my graphic scores. I just kind of stick it at the front of the PowerPoint. This page in particular, because I think it carries a lot of meaning in not only the way that a lot of my music operates or sounds or shares itself, but it's very relevant to this talk that I'm combining. Like I said, three different PowerPoints kind of mashed up together. But what had happened was way back about 4 years ago, and if you remember, around November of, 2016, Trump had just gotten elected, but in the same fall months, there was the DAPL water protector incident where they were putting a pipeline through the Hunkpapa Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota. And so Trump had just gotten elected. I was on Facebook. I was getting bummed out. I got off Facebook, but that was my only link, my only line to what was happening at Standing Rock. I was trying to follow this thing, and it was really hard to follow all of this information. So I was hearing of people getting shot at with rubber bullets. There was an incident where a woman got her arm blown off, and there was also reports of people being sprayed with hoses, and reports of undercover cops, of drones, of the wildest things, the wildest technologies that, 4 years later, 5 years later now, it kind of seems commonplace. But back then, it was very confusing, and I couldn't tell what was true and what was false. And so I had turned off Facebook completely, got off because it was just too much noise. And my friend Chanupa Hanska-Luger, artist, we collaborated recently on this Sweetland opera. He lives in Santa Fe. I live in Albuquerque most of the time. And he said, he is from Standing Rock. He said, come with me up there and we can, I need to go back and check on family, and I want to take some supplies to the camp, and come up with me if you want. So I jumped at the opportunity. I said, this is probably my only chance to see for my own eyes what's going on. There was another reason I wanted to go as well, and I have to admit this is a little bit of maybe a selfish reason, is that uh, Postcommodity, the collective I was a part of for 10 years, we were working on a sound work for the exhibition Documenta, which we were preparing for in 2017. And this work that we were making utilized LRADs, long-range acoustic devices, sonic weapons. I don't know if you can see my mouse in the screenshot, but it's this big speaker you see here in the middle of the screen where the police are aiming it at the water protectors. What it is a very loud speaker that can directionalize sound and at any target up to 5 miles away. And so what you're seeing here is them speaking to water protectors who have gathered up on the hill and telling them to come down or they will be arrested. I wasn't there, maybe they said more. And I'm certain if you can see this on your screen, there's a little red pattern on the back of that speaker, and that's the volume control. Meaning if they wanted to, they can flip this switch and turn on this siren, which can completely deafen you. My sister was up on top of this hill, and she said that when she felt them speak through the LRAD, it actually felt hot. She could feel heat coming at her. So nonetheless, even before this, this photo here is taken from the last months of the gathering, but I had heard that there were LRADs there, so I wanted to witness one for myself because we were going to buy these units for our sound installation, and I figured it was only fair that I experience one as intended or as they were made. And so that was another reason I went up there. And another thing about these LRADs, they use sound in a way to silence. So they carry a voice, but at the same time their intention is to silence other voices. Drum Grid is a work I made in 2010. It's a composition for numerous drummers, each positioned on a street corner, beginning with a single drum hit from one player. Subsequent drummers imitate the sound of the previous drummer down the block, with the gesture evolving as it travels around the neighborhood. Kind of like a broken telephone game of drums. Over time, the performers misinterpret their cues as source material, therefore adding new gestures to the original musical action, as nearby buildings and houses create more false echoes and polyphony. By performing Drum Grid, a community has agency to change the landscape of their neighborhood, activating potential questions and new generative urgencies. So in addition to being a Native person who felt obligated to go to Standing Rock, in addition to wanting to research the LRADs, there still was this noise, this information and misinformation that I really had an urge to find out what was happening. I felt guilty spreading, resharing links and whatnot if I didn't know exactly what was happening. And so ultimately, that was my main reason for heading up there. So when I arrived there, I took a look at who was there and started thinking about all of the different folks that were at this camp. And I noticed that there were a lot of course, Native folks. There was also a lot of non-Native allies there. There were also journalists there to spread the word about what was happening, to speak to others who had been at the camp. And then there was some kind of, there was quite a bit of kind of Burning Man people just kind of hanging out, looking for the party if there was one. I'm sure there were a lot of folks there looking for some kind of spiritual experience. Report is a musical composition scored for an ensemble playing various caliber of firearms. The sonic potential of revolvers, handguns, rifles, and shotguns are utilized in a tuned cacophony of percussive blasts interspersed with voids of timed silence. In the piece, guns, instruments of violence, justice, defense, and power, are transformed into mechanisms for musical resistance.
One, two, three, four. I'm going to pause it right there. I encountered another group at this camp. I saw these younger Native folks, more militant than your other water protectors, perhaps. And they had cordoned themselves off in the middle of Ocheti water protector camp. And were quite skeptical, for good reason, of everybody else in the rest of the camp. Quite guarded, quite angry, again, justifiably, at the whole situation. But what had puzzled me was that they had cordoned themselves off in the middle of the water protector camp, which is already relegated to an Indian reservation, which is already stuck in the state of North Dakota, which is already trapped inside the United States of America.
The worst thing an American Indian can do is preach to a choir that was never listening.
Silent and prayerful, guys. A power and a fire. Yep. Gotta be quiet enough for them to do that.
So I tried not to be a journalist. I always try not to be a anthropologist, and sometimes I try not to be an ethnomusicologist either. But I couldn't help but, and I can't help but always carry a small recording device in my pocket when I travel. And maybe that can serve as another kind of, set of ears or set of eyes. And I had a recording device in my pocket the 2 weeks I was there at Standing Rock. Just to make recordings. I would turn it off when I felt that there was something very heavy going on that didn't probably need to be recorded. But I knew that in the future I would be able to go back and listen and try to maybe use it to understand what I was experiencing while there and maybe not noticing. I think that recording I just played was actually on Thanksgiving Day, and you hear drones in the sky, and you actually hear two different kinds of drones. One of the drones, I'm certain, is from the DAPL security or the police, but the water protectors also had drones, their own drones. Kind of counter surveillance was happening there. And aside from all of this, Navajo ontology is utterly connected to language. When something is spoken about, not only has the possibility of its existence now entered in the consciousness and awareness of the speaker and listener, but also a whole world exists where the thing spoken about can now manifest. Here's a sound sample from the previously mentioned Native American Composers Apprenticeship project, where I teach youth on the Navajo, Hopi, and Salt River reservations to write string quartets. So new worlds are created when sounds are born, and new words and phrases and some songs also have become a taboo when sounded. This is the first piece ever made called Field Recordings. And like my continued practice of keeping a field recorder in my pocket, I had wanted to record the quietest places I knew about back growing up. So I made this piece in 1999. What would happen is I would find a place that I knew about and found to be quiet. I would go there at a time of day when maybe there were no people around, no cars on the highway, no airplanes in the sky, and maybe even no wind or breeze. I would then take this recording back to the studio and turn it up to 11. Here's a recording from the foothills of the Sandia Mountains near Albuquerque. And this one's from Canyon de Chelly, very near where I grew up, near town Chinle, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation. And the last type of folk that I encountered were just native people being together on the land. Maybe some had been there for quite a while. Maybe others lived nearby and would come up for the weekend just to be part of the presence of folks that were gathering, sharing stories, cooking, hanging out, just being, and most importantly, maybe reclaiming memory and sharing the stories of the land, or maybe the land where they come from. My Blood is in the Water. It's a piece I made with the collective Postcommodity in 2010. And it was commissioned as a response to Santa Fe's 400-year anniversary of the founding of that city. Of course, that city had been there long before contact times. And I like to call this piece a clock, that it tells time. And the way that it does this is first as a sundial. So the shadows is going to tell the time of the day. Secondly, blood drips from the mouth of this mule deer every 15 seconds. And thirdly, in all of its materials, and the way it's built, all of its materials coming from the surrounding area of Santa Fe, its mountains, the desert, the people, from top to bottom tells a story of that spot. So starting at the very top, not even maybe speaking about the land, speaking about the sky, in a time when nothing even lived in that spot. And further down, you see the deer. A friend of ours shot that deer outside in the Jemez Mountains, just southwest of Santa Fe. And that deer, being a time when still humans weren't in that area, just animals. And inside of this deer, this blood, forming another kind of life inside of this life, or this body. And that being the native people of the area. And that dripping out of the deer's mouth, having this long, uninterrupted lineage. Whatever happened in there had continued until it hits the head of the drum. And that being the contact time with the Spanish. And that making this thunderous boom. And then it mixing on the head of the drum, becoming even more people, becoming new people, and then dripping back off into the ground. So in 2017, Postcommodity was able to get these two LRADs. We actually bought one of them on eBay, believe it or not. And made this piece, The Ears Between Worlds Are Always Speaking. The Ears Between Worlds Is Always Speaking is a long form, 2-channel, hyperdirectional music composition projected upon the ancient ruins of Aristotle's Lyceum in Athens, Greece. Broadcasting for 100 days during the Documenta 14 exhibition, The Ears Between Worlds is an all-day piece, sound work, consisting of 22 songs, the libretto gathered from the narratives of refugees from Syria and Afghanistan who have arrived in Greece, as well as stories from migrants who have traversed the desert of the US-Mexico borderlands. Additionally, the sound work has stories and songs from the Navajo Long Walk and the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Both of these instances being where the US government was trying to remove indigenous people from their homelands and kill them in the process. And so what the piece is there's actually nothing installed in the Lyceum, but 2 LRADs were mounted on the rooftops of the Hellenic Armed Forces Officers Club and the Athens Conservatory of Music, both buildings surrounding the Lyceum. Aristotle's Lyceum is the site of the School of Peripatetic Learning, where Aristotle and his students would walk along this path, and that's where they would conduct their lessons. At the installation, audiences experience a shifting call and response, hyperdirectionality of sound when walking around the ruins of the school. Our feeling was that today we are witnessing the greatest mass migration in the history of mankind, and that we are in the potential presence of 60 million scholars seeking refuge.
και ποτάμια στη διαδρομή.
The Journey of the Horizontal People is a string quartet commissioned by Kronos Quartet. The piece is designed so that the players become lost from each other as the music progresses through time. It requires that the quartet include a woman so that she can realign the group when they lose their way. It's written in such a way the quartet is going to get lost. The Journey of the Horizontal People is a future creation story, telling of a group of people traveling from west to east, across the written page, contrary to the movement of the sun, but involuntarily and unconsciously allegiant to the trappings of time. With their bows, these wanderers sought out others like them, knowing that they could survive by finding these other clans that resided in the east, others who shared their linear cosmologies. It is told that throughout the journey, in their own passage of time, this group became the very people that they were seeking. You can listen to this piece on Kronos Quartet's website, but I won't play it now. But back to the device in my pocket. A few days after that previous recording on Thanksgiving, where you heard hundreds, maybe a couple thousand people yelling, screaming at the DAPL security, tired, frustrated, saying, just leave. We don't want you here. You are ruining the earth. The Sunday after that day, the eldest women of the camp walked across on the main highway that goes up to Bismarck, or one of those cities up there, that had been barricaded off by the police. The police were not allowing travel to go to the cities. Again, trying to disrupt life, maybe trying to kill us. So at that barricade, the eldest women of the camp walked right up to the line, 500 people, maybe more, behind them, and just stood and stared at the police and the DAPL security. So this recording is the sound of 500 or 600 people doing absolutely nothing but staring. And so this was another PowerPoint I tacked onto this for you all. And this led up to, this picks back up at COVID time. Since 2016, I've been listening to these recordings and trying to understand again what was happening and really analyzing the dynamic of what was happening. I mean, on that recording, you heard the power of no dynamic speaking in the music terms, volume. And so with all of these recordings, I thought I might put it into a score form. And I was telling my wife and collaborator, Candace Hopkins, who also writes a lot on sound, about my experience there. And so we came up with this piece called Dispatch. Dispatch, I'll read the description. Dispatch is either a transcription of events around the 2016 DAPL encroachment at Standing Rock, or it's a prompt for an ecological oral future, or at the very least, it's a critique of the privilege of meditative deep listening. the score can be realized as a performance or as a series of imagined events. It can also be enacted in the real world. The players, the prompts, and the schematics are derived from an analysis of the surface dynamics and organization of the water protectors in defense of Standing Rock. Not glossing over the miscommunications, the profiteering, and the injustices. In an increasingly fractured society, new paths and new formations are needed to refocus our attention in an attempt to find the truth. Participating in this score may produce sonic or visual artifacts. These are as important as the actions. This rock is under threat. We need to gather here to protect it. Our actions begin and end at this place. The players. I won't go in depth in all of these, as you can read it here, but as I described, this replicates some of the folks that I encountered at Standing Rock and therefore become the instrumentation, if you will, for this piece. There's hosts, people who have lived and who live and have lived in this place for centuries. Spiritual leaders, frontline activists, native or non-native folks, the militant indigenous folks that I spoke about, narcs, undercover cops, they were there, they're always there. Helpers, this can be a big Venn diagram, but we like to think everybody's a helper in some way, or tries to be. Witnesses, no matter who you are, you're a witness. Artists tend to find their way to these places. Sometimes they're very helpful, sometimes they're just in the way. Gatekeepers, people who maintain the entrance to the camp. Temporary campers, sympathizers. I guess we have influencers now. There's also people without a home. And we like to think that, at a minimum, one can be a witness or a helper, at the very least. We write, I'm gonna have to turn on the light here in a second, it's getting no more natural light. Rocks have harmonics, resonant frequencies. They're also deities. Lives begun millions of years ago. They are witnesses to the formation of the earth. They can pick up the tremors of extractive colonialism, exposing wide caverns that lead to the trails deep inside the ground, generating sludge and slurry, releasing poisons meant to stay undisturbed. The time is now to protect these rocks as though it is a last stand. Our gathering can open up the way to other worlds, those of our own making. These other worlds are not the decolonial ones, but the non-colonial ones. Not bound by their frameworks, but by ours. Heeding this call is the first action. In this action, we come together in person or at a distance, or on Zoom, if you will, to open up a portal of shared experiences. So the prompts to perform the score, choose one or more of the prompts to follow. And there's a schematic here I'll show in a second. You can heed the call. If you're a host, you find yourself to be a host, or you would like to play the role of a host, let's say, you determine points of reference. If you are not already at this site, you should go there. If you're a gatekeeper, you welcome and relay the protocols of place. No matter who you are, you can do nothing. You can also listen, and you should listen. You should attempt to listen beyond, to your immediate surroundings, to the land or water, or to the sounds outside of your normal range. I suppose these could even be unnatural or encroaching sounds that you should listen beyond to. Sustain yourself. Don't be in the way. Don't encroach. Broadcast outward. Create a small gathering for one activity. Do something together. Cook, pray, sing, teach a game. If necessary, initiate a larger gathering. You can always witness, and you should always witness, and relay what you learned. Or you could translate a broadcast for other listeners. So perhaps you might consider a different language, different tone, yourself as a person who can relay this message. So this is the schematic. I'm going to turn on the light. So this schematic is a way to help share this message, perhaps to decode this noise that I was speaking about earlier. You can repeat a message. You can relay a message. A group of people can help broadcast the message. You can be loud, and maybe that gets the message to many people. You can have a very long duration for the message. Maybe this is your life's work. Or maybe it does require a change, a tone change, a language change. Perhaps a woman needs to be said what a man has been saying, or vice versa. Perhaps an elder needs to say what a child has been saying, or vice versa. And all of everybody within those spectrums. And what is this message? Perhaps this message is coming from one of the hosts, an elder, a knowledge keeper. And where are they getting their message from? Of course, it's coming from the earth, the rock that we are trying to protect. This score can be realized as a performance or a series of imagined events. It can also be enacted in the real world. The players, the prompts, and the schematics are derived from an analysis of the dynamics and organization of the water protectors in defense of Standing Rock. Prompts. Set 2. Choose one path to get back to the rock. With clear aim, do not waver. Schematic 2 can be used as an aid to trace 6 possible paths back to the rock. Establish the protocols necessary for the next defense. Amplify the call. Gather the players. Establish the roles. Determine the parameters of allyship. Move to another site needing protection. Together, define your actions, maintaining the camp, defending the rock, and so on. So all of those can be ways to carry that message, to maybe further this prompt or this proposition into some kind of direct action, or to simply end the piece if we find resolution. In 2016, a delegation of 5 women, Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, Waste Wing Young, Tara Huska, Autumn Chacon, my sister, and Michelle Cook, on behalf of water protectors during No DAPL, continued their activism elsewhere as a way to further erode the links between extractive colonialism and capitalism. By uncovering the funders of the pipeline, from banks to private corporations, they made a public call for them to divest. In March 2017, they traveled to Norway and Switzerland to meet with banking personnel to explain how their investments were directly impacting the lives of American Indian people, particularly women and children, polluting water and degrading land in a violation of indigenous rights. The Norwegian bank, DNB, decided to completely divest, and others have yet to heed their call. So thank you for listening, and I hope there's some questions.
Yes, thank you, Raven, for that presentation. And yes, there are some questions, and we'd like to invite folks to use the Q&A function to submit their own questions. But I think I asked students in my class to think about some questions ahead of time after looking at your work, and I think something that stood out to them, which I'm sure stood out to folks that are joining us here tonight, is the ways in which you combine audio and visual scores in your work. One student, Samantha, shared that she found it interesting how you combine both audio, your music, with your visual scores, since right now she's currently in a class that does the same thing. And her question would be, what made you decide to combine both audio and visuals together? And similarly, Kara wanted to know why it was important for people to visually see the music you have composed in relation to your art installations and your sheet music serving as a flag and representation of where the music originates from.
Okay, so a few questions in there. The training I happened to fall into came from different ways. I mean, part of it was the classical notated music, Western kind of education that I guess was maybe forced upon me. Like I took piano lessons and I liked it, and it gave me an understanding of music, at least in the Western classical tradition. I was careful to not assume that that was the correct way to make music. As we know, most musicians in the world and throughout time don't read dots on paper. But it was another language for me to work with. At the same time, I was doing other kinds of experiments, building instruments, playing around with cassette tapes, and making other kinds of recordings and sound projects, and performing these kinds of things too. Doing performances. But somewhere in there, I came to the realization that not everything is going to fit on the stage or in a score, and that there were other ways to make work, or other ways that the work can exist. And that's what led to the sound installations. And then just thinking of different tactics to present that work, whether it was sculptural, whether it was moving image, video. So that's why I move in all those different places. It usually starts with the idea and then finds the best way for that to exist, whether it belongs on a record or CD or on the stage or in a white cube. Or on a video. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm still working on. That's what I'm still developing, what I'm still learning. I've had a long time interest in video and film, and still learning how to do all of this kind of stuff. And then collaboration. Musicians naturally collaborate and have no problem linking up with other folks, more than maybe any other kind of artist. Musicians are kind of good. I shouldn't say they're good. I mean, there's musicians who don't get along with each other, but we try. And so that's also another way to broaden what you do. And that's, in working with maybe people who weren't exactly musicians, Postcommodity, then, we would share skill sets, we would trade ideas, and that made the piece even that much more expansive. now the question about the score is really just the tool to share the instructions about what the music is with other musicians. It's the document, it's even the instruction manual, if you will, the IKEA manual that tells you how to build the bookshelf. I mean, that could be a score. So sometimes it's necessary in that sense to share ideas, but I'm also not so rigid or exact with the scores either. There's a lot of freedom and fluidity in the way that they can be interpreted sometimes. So I try to build that into each of those compositions. I try to make all of these situations be a collaboration if I can.
Thank you. Raven, really liked your presentation quite a bit. And there are some questions here that people are asking as we were talking. And one of them comes from Mawani. And they ask, they say, first of all, I want to say, I admire your work and your sister's bravery at Standing Rock. With this, I'm very intrigued by the connections you share amongst your tribes. And I wonder, what is the process in welcoming new members? How does one approach their new roots? And I'm thinking maybe there's in your score, that address that somewhat in the dispatch.
Well, I'm not sure if this question is real world or some kind of proposition. I don't know how somebody becomes a new member other than being born into one or marrying into one. So honestly, that's one way to be. But maybe you're speaking more about other kinds of communities. And I think that was what we're trying to analyze with this dispatch score, trying to think of how one can be an ally, right? And what maybe that position can be. And that's why we say being a helper and a witness at the very least is something that's quite powerful, and having a willingness to learn about what's happening. And we do know that having the 12,000 people show up at Standing Rock helped bring attention to that situation. And even if it was like I said, the Burning Man, people were there just looking for whatever. That I acknowledge that was still quite helpful in maintaining a presence. I'm sure that freaked out the DAPL security, and I'm really thankful that nothing really horrible happened at that situation. But at the same time, we are all witnesses right now, and anything. I mean, we didn't write the score to be an instruction manual to solve the world or solve Standing Rock. It was more to try to attempt to decode. If at least there can be a way to say, okay, we can't just look on Facebook and reshare the thing blindly. That was really our motivation for making that score.
Okay, all right, thank you.
We had a couple of questions from students pertaining to whether or not there's a right way to listen to your pieces, Raven. Some students said that when they've listened to them, they felt as they were like not doing it correctly, which was interesting. Benjamin shared that. And his question was, is there a way for us listeners to understand the music or sound that is presented in your works? Or is there a way to change our traditional habits of how we listen to sound, to music?
I'd say don't listen through laptop speakers. Try to listen to it on a good system. Turn on original sound. No, seriously. I think it takes time to listen to experimental music, so-called experimental music. The more you listen to it, I think the more you appreciate it, or the more you can understand your own gauge of saying, I like that, I don't like that. And it's funny, we listen to experimental sounds all day. You walk down the street and these construction people are jackhammering a street or whatever, or building something. I mean, that can have its own music. And we listen to horror, we watch horror movies, and that has some very dissonant and atonal kind of sound. But I think also just being aware of this and seeking out, looking up blogs. Now more than ever, there's an opportunity to listen to music from all over. And I'm not just talking about the so-called experimental music. I mean, there's music being made all over the world that is beautiful. So giving that a chance, I mean, trying to listen to as many things as possible was definitely something I did and tried to do ongoing. But in regards to my own music, I tried to, some of the work, let me put it this way, I've more recently maybe even not even prioritized the sounds that I like, or I don't make sounds that I might like, or even audible, like some of the sounds aren't even audible. The importance for me with these sounds is more maybe their conceptual reason for being a piece of music or being in a piece of music. I mean, we heard the drip of blood onto the drum. Well, that's a very simple sound. I'm more interested in the conditions of that sound, or why that sound is being made, or what that sound, what that instrument is. Where it is also of great importance. So I do try to provide handles on some of these works and encourage people to read about, you know, what that might be. And if it's a CD or record, I try to put it in the liner notes. Hope that helps.
Yeah, there's a couple of, I have a question from a student and a question from an attendee. Both, I think, segue well. Minnie asks or says that the sound of the blood dripping from the deer during the sound installation reminds me, she says, of how sounds have histories and memories. And the way you explained contact with Spanish and the creation of new people and more people reminds me of that. So the question is, are there different feelings, memories, or histories that come up for you when you heard this sound, and are you open to sharing any of them with us?
When I heard the drum sound?
The sound of the blood dripping on the drum. Was there feeling, memory, history for you?
Well, I should point out that there is a contact mic on that drum, and it's amplified at a great volume to the Plaza of Santa Fe. And it was also erected during a market that happens annually called the Santa Fe Indian Market, which is a complicated event. It's an event there for Native artisans, craftspeople, artists to exhibit and sell things that they make throughout the year: jewelry, pottery, mostly what's considered traditional arts. Quite beautiful work, but also quite commercial. You know, I mean, you have to applaud it for also giving a marketplace for people to make maybe their whole year's living in that weekend. Long story short, it's not the place for contemporary art, we could say, or noise music, or blood dripping from a deer. So I can't really say that we fine-tuned anything about that sound other than the specificity of the drum, which is a Taos Pueblo drum, but we made sure to get it from a place where it was already tainted. So we bought it at the airport. If that gives some indication of why we did the piece in the first place and when we did the piece. So it wasn't so much about the response to history or finding, listening inside of that, but I really appreciate what you're saying, that it can have this power to it, and I believe in that as well. But more so, I think the sound in that case was a response to where the conditions of where it would be exhibited.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and thank you for that question, because it's it really is. I mean, there's other pieces which do conjure memories, or I feel like they reference something that has happened, but not that piece.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and we had actually a couple of students ask around the ways in which past, present, and future time operate in the work. One student, Daisy, asks if you believe the distortion of visual and sound elements is a good way of delivering a message pertaining to things like erasure. And Ashley also wanted to know how does nonlinear storytelling provide a richer and more authentic demonstration of the experiences and concepts that you are exploring?
Wow, really good question, and I hope I can answer that, because it is key to all my work that that, let's say, this reason for using noise or silence surely has conceptual reasons. And in fact, this opera we did last year that got shut down due to COVID, it was called Sweetland. It was an entire opera about the manifest destiny history of the United States. And this might be the best example of using this kind of nonlinearity or maybe dual linearity or hiding of elements to speak to this erasure. So what the opera was you bought a ticket and you went, everybody saw the first act together. Then the audience was split and you saw either an opera about maybe the first Thanksgiving, but also a kind of forced marriage, or you saw an opera about how the train was built to crisscross the United States and what that led to. And so as you're watching this, you can kind of hear, this is all an outdoors opera also, you can kind of hear the parallel opera being performed just within earshot. And you're always kind of aware that you're missing out on something, or maybe you're not being given the full story, or maybe the story is being even whitewashed in some way. So what happens throughout the opera is you repeat scenes, but you're seeing it as we're saying, maybe as you were taught in school, like not quite getting the full story, or you're getting a very cleaned up version. That's one tactic. Noise is another, and for me, noise is not to convey my frustrations or anger. It's not my scream at the white man or anything like that. I've had people write about that. It's not about that. It's a sonority that I like. In the case of the field recordings piece, it was my tactic for letting the land speak by turning the land's voice all the way up. Perhaps you were given an insight into magnifying the land. I can't remember other parts of that question. Was there? I hope I answered it.
Yeah, no. I think you spoke about it. It's something that we've been discussing in our class, just as different conceptions of time that are not linear, that I think challenge the kind of discourse around progress, right? In terms of industrialization and modernization and essentially colonization, right? So I think that they were asking about how that manifests in the work. Yeah.
The linearity is also important in trying to just think of form, and trying to think of this kind of also uniformity of, let's say, the string quartet that I showed, of saying we're just going to go from point A to point B, when there's all these other options and agencies that I try to build into that. And giving this to the eldest woman in the ensemble was important to me. So being able to stretch it out, be able to maybe take it away from me being the sole author in that sense and making it more of a collaboration. If anything, it's that collaborative model that I try to use, and nonlinearity can facilitate that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So maybe we have time for a couple of more.
Yeah, I have a student asks, we're learning about deep listening as a meditative practice. I understand this is one way of listening, but how do you practice listening to the world around you?
I appreciate deep listening, but as I said in the piece, this dispatch was a bit of a critique at that. It was trying to think, okay, what is deep listening today? Or if you live in a city, what's the deep listening? If you're surrounded by noises, what is the deep listening? And I'm sure that the deep listening folk have considered all of this, but what Candace and I were really getting at is, how do you exercise this deep listening in a state of emergency when you're being attacked by the police, or they're trying to get you off the hill in North Dakota and aiming an LRAD at you? What is that deep listening? I trust that there's still some deep listening, but it's a deep listening when your life is at stake, or your land is at stake, or you're being arrested. So just to point that out as far as our questions about deep listening. How do I listen? The tactic too has been, like I said, carry a field recorder, try to analyze that. I also have become less concerned about fidelity. I mean, maybe that was always there, given the noise kind of choices that I've made, but um, I'm not always concerned with that in spitting that back out. I am concerned about legibility in a sense that maybe something doesn't get obscured or changed through my own filter, but I just try to capture things as we can. I mean, we all have iPhones now. We can make a quick recording like that. I like to listen back to those instances. Of course, a whole discussion about improvisation too. I love to play with other musicians. That any musician that I can. It's been hard over the past year, of course, but that is completely facilitated and needed. And what's needed is this listening to do that. You know, you listen to the person you're playing with, and so I constantly think about that importance of being able to listen to other musicians.
You know, with the field recording, it's interesting because when you think of traditional field recording, it's such an extractive process. And so the way you've just talked about listening to, you know, what's going on around you in an urgent situation or what's going around you, collaborating with musicians, it's certainly not that. It's more of a expansive, non-filtered process. At least that's how I think of it, not as extractive. Mm-hmm. So I like the work you did with the landscapes because it wasn't about extracting in that quiet space. It was about amplifying evenly what was happening there. So just wanted to say, I like that. You're welcome.
Yeah, maybe we can end with a question or two. Students wanted to know just advice that you had. I think one of them asked specifically about approaching composition and how you approach composition. As you begin to compose these pieces, Hannah asks of work, what is the first thing you think about as far as where you want to take the composition and how you want to structure it? And Daniel also wanted to know if you initially plan a narrative and create your project around the narrative, or if you allow your artwork to inform you on what it's about.
That's a really good question. I think there's two factors I think of right away. One of them is who is performing it and for who. So what that often comes down to is place, is then becomes a question of where this is going to happen. And when that question comes up, then there might be something to respond to, a history of that place, some site specificity. A lot of times that gets worked into it. Also, as you saw with maybe the drum piece, I try to not limit these to just being so-called trained musicians, you know, Western classical musicians. So anybody can hit a drum and anybody can listen. I have a big interest in making more pieces like that. The dispatch piece also, I mean, maybe works that can, or scores that can be both a transcription of something, but also then a prescription. That's something I have a current interest in also. And yeah, and then if it is a more formal composition, still the instruments, the instrumentation, the sounds, that's still a priority in there. I still have I have a great respect for the classical instruments, even though I might come off like I'm saying I'm not, a fan of classical music or anything. I have a huge respect for those instruments. I don't think those instruments can get better, in some ways. In fact, I don't even process those too often because I feel like I'm still learning from them and trying to understand how they work. So that's there's still that part of it of me being a perpetual, eternal music student and trying to learn more about these instruments and what they can do.
There are more questions coming in. I don't know a lot. There's a lot more. Musée, what do you think? Do you have more from your students, or Should we?
We can maybe take one more from the Q&A. You can pick
Okay.
Christine. and I have a couple. I think we can maybe end with a flurry of
Really
questions,
good.
and we can
There's
let
some
Raven
really-
decide.
There's some really good ones here. One of our people in the audience asks, Lucy asks, can you talk a bit about the process for the Gunshot composition and whether the players were musicians or how they learned to shoot? I had heard you talk about this piece before and it was really interesting, and what conversations emerged amongst the players.
Yeah, I'll tell you the full story of this, and maybe this is a good one to end on. I wrote this piece very early on as a composer in the undergrad program at University of New Mexico. I was still, learning about so-called experimental music and trying to just, I don't know. I think there's probably a point every composer just tries to do like something wild. It wasn't that kind of test. It was kind of the opposite. It was that I started thinking, there's too much freedom in this. I could just put random dots on the paper and it might sound like experimental music. It was too arbitrary, some of these decisions. Oh, I'll just put a note here, or I'll just do this or that. It was, my mind was blown wide open at the possibilities of experimental music. So I wanted to give myself limitations. I actually wanted to do the opposite. I said, what instrument can I have where I have no control of pitch, no control of volume, no control of tuning or harmony, everything just out the window. And I couldn't escape rhythm. So I was really gonna just write a piece for like snare drums or something. But even that can have volume. So I said, oh, guns. Guns would be an instrument that could do that. And so I scored the piece and got together 7 other musicians than myself to play the piece. It was basically the UNM percussion department. I bought a bunch of ammo. So fortunately, these percussionists had guns already. Many of them did. I got us together to rehearse just on drums first. And I looked at all of us and I said, what am I saying with this? This looks bad, actually. There's a bunch of dudes, drummers, with guns. And so I actually abandoned that project. It existed, the score was out there, people had interest in it. I would get a lot of asks about it. It was all guys. And I said, I'm still thinking about what this is. And years later, I was able to find the right people to do this. Equal number of men and women, all of them with some familiarity of guns, coming from diverse backgrounds. And then I thought, okay, well, let me do it. Let me try it and let me film it. It's important. It then became important about who was shooting. And of course, you have to do it outside. And so this work I had already been doing of making site-specific work, then the question came up of, where are they? What are they shooting at? And those questions became more interesting to me, or they added more layers onto the piece. So the piece was never intended to be, pro-gun, anti-gun, anything like that. But I really was pleased that it did start raising these other questions about defense, offense, land, history, much like the deer piece, very close to the deer piece in a lot of ways. And in fact, that video was shot in Santa Fe also, so just 10 miles away from where the deer piece was. So that's where the piece remains as this generator of questions. And I imagine that could happen depending who plays it and where they play it. And it might be one of those pieces where I need to kind of steer the performances of that, so I don't end up with some militia, some crazy militia who reads percussion music notes.
That's funny. I was wondering if these were gun owners and people who could read music.
That was another reason why it took a long time to find people, and because you do have to read the notes. It's a notated piece. So the score is on my website for anybody who wants to see, that. And it's funny. I still there is still tuning in there. The different calibers of guns provide a different, bass, alto, tenor, all of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Raven. And yeah, I think seeing the time, I think we can end with that. And thank you once again for your generous participation in the series and for answering all the questions. And yeah, thank you everyone for participating also and for assisting this presentation. The recording will be available on YouTube in the coming weeks. So if you missed any of it, you can check it out. And thank you again, Raven, for being here and for joining us and sharing your work.
Yes, thank you so much. It was really great.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right.
All right. Well, good night, everyone.
Can everybody come back for the next Resounding Visions?
Yeah, on April 1st.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Raven. Thank you.
Bye.